He thought she was just a dusty librarian with no story worth telling. But buried beneath those silent shelves was a legacy that once shook a nation, and he had just laughed at it. It was a slow, golden afternoon in the sleepy heart of Willow Ridge, a small suburban town where time often seemed to walk rather than run. The sun hung lazily in the sky, casting long beams through the tall windows of the town's community library. Dust motes floated like tiny dancers in the light, swirling gently between the narrow aisles of aged bookshelves. The air was still warm, quiet, and wrapped in the comforting scent of old paper and polished wood. It was the kind of place where whispers felt loud, and the ticking of the antique wall clock echoed like a drumbeat. In the far corner of the library, behind a long wooden counter lined with returned books, stood Miss Ruth Carter. She was a woman of quiet presence, tall, with a graceful poise that carried years of unspoken stories. Her skin was a rich, warm brown, marked by time in the gentle folds around her eyes. Long strands of grey wove through her tight, coiled hair, which she often tied back with a patterned scarf that matched her soft hand-knitted sweaters. Today she wore a deep maroon cardigan and a flowing, ankle-length skirt the color of autumn leaves. She moved with slow precision, her hands gliding over spines and covers like a pianist over keys. As she sorted a cart of returned books, she hummed a soft tune under her breath, a spiritual melody half remembered from childhood, rising and falling like waves against a quiet shore. The kind of sound that made the silence feel sacred. To most people, Miss Carter was just a librarian, a gentle figure, always there, always calm. But to those who looked closer or bothered to ask, there was something more in her eyes, a quiet wisdom, a patience carved from experience, a knowing smile that often arrived before her words. Then the heavy front door creaked open, a gust of new air swept through the quiet, and Jake entered loud in presence even without saying a word. 13. Lanky, always fidgeting, he carried himself with the confidence of someone who hadn't yet discovered what he didn't know. His sneakers squeaked against the polished wood floor, and the bright glow of his phone screen illuminated his face more than the afternoon sun ever did. Jake was like most boys his age, restless, curious, but too proud to admit it. His head was down as he typed furiously on some group chat, earbuds hanging around his neck like an accessory rather than a tool. He wore a hoodie with a local skate brand and jeans with deliberate rips at the knees. He didn't come here for the books, he came because his mother made him read something that doesn't scroll, she had said sternly that morning. He sighed as he walked past the front desk and caught a glimpse of Miss Carter still humming, still sorting. He rolled his eyes, still dusting those dinosaur books. "Missy," he called out with a smirk, his voice echoing louder than necessary. Miss Carter didn't flinch. She simply looked up, the corners of her lips turning ever so slightly. "There's treasure in dust, you know," she said gently. "If you're patient enough to look." Jake chuckled under his breath and muttered something sarcastic as he passed. He had no intention of finding treasure here. To him, the library was a relic, a place for people who didn't have the internet. He plopped down into one of the deep reading chairs near the magazine rack, phone in hand, thumbs still flying. Miss Carter returned to her work without another word, sliding a worn copy of To Kill a Mockingbird back into its rightful place. Her humming continued, a little quieter now, but steady. Outside, the branches of the maple tree swayed softly in the breeze. Inside, the stillness returned, only broken by the turning of a page, the hum of the air conditioning, and the occasional sigh of a boy who hadn't yet learned that stories were sometimes hidden in the most unlikely people. And behind the front desk, tucked beneath a few reference sheets and an old calendar, sat a leather-bound notebook with frayed edges. Its pages were filled with writing tight, deliberate cursive that told of things long past and deeply felt. Miss Carter glanced at it briefly, then placed another book on the shelf, her hands moving with the calm of someone who knew that even laughter, especially the dismissive kind, didn't last forever, because sometimes the loudest lessons came not with shouting, but in silence, and Jake was about to learn one. The next day, the hush of the library was broken earlier than usual. It was just past 3 in the afternoon when the front door burst open with a loud clang, letting in a burst of laughter, sneakers, and careless energy. Jake was back, but this time, he wasn't alone. 2 other boys trailed behind him, both loud in the way only 13-year-olds trying to impress each other could be. Their backpacks swung from one shoulder, their voices carrying without care or volume. Control. One of them had a slushie in hand, dripping red syrup onto the polished floor. Jake swaggered in at the front, glancing around the room, a bored king surveying a kingdom he didn't want to rule. "Dude, this place is ancient," Jake said, loud enough to reach every corner of the library. "Smells like ... retirement and mothballs." His friends snorted with laughter. One of them mimicked sniffing the air and gagged dramatically. "No wonder no one comes here," he added. "It's like a tomb with books." Behind the main counter, Ms. Ruth Carton looked up from her desk. She had been reviewing a book return list, her reading glasses resting low on her nose. With practice calm, she removed them and folded them gently, placing them on top of the paper stack. She didn't say a word. "Not yet." Jake locked eyes with her, and something in his expression shifted from amusement to provocation. He tilted his head toward her, as if he'd just remembered she existed. "Oh, hey," he said, stepping forward with a mocking grin. "Didn't mean to wake you up back there, miss. You still doing this, like, all day, just organizing dusty old stuff?" He turned to his friends for effect. "She probably sleeps between the shelves," he said. "Bet she hasn't left this building since 1980. Kinda spooky, right?" Laughter again, louder this time. It echoed between the walls lined with hardcovers and faded encyclopedias. Jake leaned on the counter like he owned the place, tapping his fingers and waiting for a reaction. Ms. Carter didn't flinch. Her eyes, soft but steady, studied the boys with the kind of gaze that made you feel like she already knew how the story ended. Then she smiled. It wasn't cold. It wasn't mocking. It was something much harder to read, half patience, half understanding, and just a whisper of sadness. "There's more power in silence than in noise, young man," she said calmly, her voice low and even. "But most people don't realize that until they have nothing left to say." Jake blinked. The grin faltered for half a second, just a flicker. But pride caught him before anything else could. He rolled his eyes and pushed away from the counter. "Whatever that means," he muttered, laughing it off like a smudge on his sleeve. "Come on, guys." The boys moved away, joking and bumping shoulders, wandering toward the graphic novel section, where they could be noisy without being near the creepy old librarian. As they disappeared behind the shelves, Miss Carter let out a long, soft sigh. She turned away from the desk and reached into the drawer beneath her workstation. From beneath a stack of return slips and bookmarks, she pulled out a leather-bound notebook. Its cover was scuffed and worn, the edges frayed like it had been handled 1,000 times before. She opened it slowly, flipping past pages filled with tight, looping cursive, her handwriting, thoughts, fragments, scenes, entire lives inked in silence. Her fingers hovered above a page, then gently closed the book. She held it for a moment, then placed it back in the drawer and shut it quietly, almost reverently. The sounds of the boys laughing in the distance drifted back to her, bouncing off the shelves and glass. She didn't chase after them. She never did. She had learned long ago that time was a better teacher than words. Back by the fantasy aisle, Jake pulled a brightly colored manga off the shelf, still grinning. "Man, did you see her face?" he said. "It's like she thought she just dropped a mic or something." His friends chuckled, but not as hard this time. One of them glanced back toward the front desk, thoughtful. Jake didn't notice. He was already flipping through pages, uninterested in anything deeper than what fit in a meme dot. But behind the desk, in that quiet corner of the world where the light filtered through high windows and the dust shimmered like stars, Miss Carter resumed her work. Her fingers slid across familiar titles. Her lips resumed the gentle humming of a tune long forgotten by the world. but never by her. Because she knew, one day, the noise would fade, and the silence would speak volumes. The days that followed were quieter, not because Jake had changed. He still dragged his feet into the library with that same bored expression, but the laughter had softened. Something unspoken lingered in the air, like a shift in the weather. You couldn't quite name. He still came mostly because his mom insisted, and he still brought his phone, but he no longer swaggered through the front door. Not as much. Anyway, it began with something small. One Thursday afternoon, Jake walked in a little later than usual, earbuds dangling and hoodie half zipped. He passed the front desk without a word, half expecting the usual stillness of the library to swallow him whole. But instead, he found something unusual. There was a woman probably in her late 20s standing at the counter. Her coat was damp from the rain outside, and her hands clutched a book to her chest. Her eyes were red, not from crying exactly, but from something close. She looked nervous, unsure. Ms. Carter stood behind the desk, just as calm and composed as always, listening quietly. I had to come, the young woman said softly, her voice shaking just a little. I read your book in college. It changed how I saw everything. I never imagined I'd actually find you here. Miss Carter smiled gently, warmly. You found me just fine, she said. I'm always right here. The two women spoke for a few more minutes, and Jake watched. From behind a shelf, pretending to browse, the woman reached into her bag and pulled out a paperback copy. She asked for an autograph. Jake's brows furrowed. Wait. Miss Carter wrote a book. He didn't ask. Not yet. He wasn't even sure if he'd imagined the whole thing. Maybe it was some book club thing. Maybe the woman had her confused with someone else. But the next week, there was a man, middle-aged, with a tailored coat and a suit that didn't belong in this neighborhood. He stepped into the library with confidence, but when he reached the front desk, his shoulders lowered. There was humility in the way he spoke, the way he bowed his head just slightly. Jake couldn't hear the whole exchange. He only caught fragments from the magazine aisle. Meant a lot. Growing up. Never forgot what you said to me. The man handed her something, a bouquet of wildflowers, wrapped in plain brown paper, and a small envelope. Miss Carter accepted them with a smile that looked almost nostalgic, as if it reminded her of something long ago. She didn't make a show of it. She tucked the envelope into her sweater pocket and continued shelving books, like nothing unusual had happened. Jake, however, sat frozen behind a stack of superhero comics, pretending to read, but not turning a page. It wasn't just a one-time thing. It happened again and again. A teenage girl with a notebook full of scribbled poems, who hugged Miss Carter tightly before leaving. A father and son, who just came to say thank you. Even the mail carrier lingered longer these days, chatting with Miss Carter like she was more than a librarian, like she was some kind of landmark. Jake found himself watching more than scrolling. He didn't tell his friends about it. Somehow, it felt personal, private, like opening a door you weren't supposed to know existed. But still, the questions built in his mind. Who was she? Why did people keep coming back? One late afternoon, just before closing time, the library had all but emptied. The golden light spilled across the floor, stretching like long arms between the aisles. Jake sat alone at one of the corner tables, doodling in the margins of a worksheet. He wasn't really doing. It was quiet, peaceful. Then he heard the soft click of a keyboard. He glanced toward the front desk and saw Miss Carter behind her old laptop, an outdated silver model with a slightly flickering screen. She was typing slowly, thoughtfully, her fingers pausing every few lines. Her expression was unreadable, calm, focused, but also distant, like she wasn't here at all. Then she stopped. Her hand reached toward the drawer. That same leather-bound notebook emerged, edges now even more worn than before. She opened it carefully and began to write, her pen gliding across the page with purpose. Her eyes moved between the screen and the paper, as if translating something sacred from one medium to another. Jake didn't move. He didn't want to disturb the moment. Something about it felt intimate, sacred, like he was witnessing someone mid-prayer. He watched for a full minute too, maybe until she finally closed the book, slid it back into the drawer, and resumed her soft humming, that same haunting melody from before. Jake looked down at his worksheet. Suddenly, the blank spaces felt heavier, like they mattered more. He couldn't explain why, but something had shifted inside him. For the first time, he didn't just wonder what she was writing, he wanted to know. The week passed without incident. The library visits continued, quieter now, more thoughtful. Jake still didn't say much to Miss Carter, didn't dare ask the questions that hovered on the tip of his tongue. But something had shifted. He came, not just to check in as his mother demanded, but to observe, to sit near the front instead of the back, to sketch less and listen more. Then came the assignment. It was a Friday, and the classroom buzzed with groans as Mr. Landry, Jake's English teacher, handed out a thin worksheet with big block letters at the top. Independent reading project. Find a book that moved you, not something you had to read. Mr. Landry emphasized, something you chose to read, something that made you feel confused, angry, inspired, anything, just as long as it's not on the school list. Due in 2 weeks. Jake stared at the instructions like they were in a foreign language. Feel something. What did that even mean? He sighed, folded the paper in half, and shoved it into his backpack. Later that weekend, during one of his mom's device detox hours, Jake found himself trudging into a downtown bookstore. The place smelled like roasted coffee and new paper. Shelves towered over him in polished wood, with signs neatly pointing to your fantasy, romance, and true crime. He wandered aimlessly, hoping something would magically stand out and do the work for him. That's when he saw it. A table near the center of the store held a gleaming metal sign. National bestsellers, memoir and historical fiction. Most of the covers were moody or sepia-toned. Jake's eyes skimmed over titles, until one caught him mid-step. He didn't know why. Maybe it was the way the title whispered, instead of shouted. Shadows in the Wind by R.M. Carter. Cover was understated, just a black and white photo of an old tree bent by time, its branches stretching across a dirt road. There was something haunting about it, familiar, almost. Jake picked it up. The paper was soft, the pages slightly cream-colored. The weight of the book felt serious, like it wanted to be held, not skimmed. He flipped to the first page, and froze. Dedication to the children who never knew the full story, and to those who laughed before they listened. Jake's chest tightened. He read the words again, slower this time. There was no doubt. The phrasing, the tone, it rang in his mind like a bell, like something aimed directly at him. His fingers trembled slightly as he turned the page to the prologue. The sound of footsteps in a church basement was the first music I ever remembered. They came before the songs, before the sermons. I was 6. My brother was 4. We learned early that silence could mean safety. But stories, those were where the healing began. Jake read the paragraph 3 times. His mouth felt dry. He flipped to the back cover. There it was, a small author photo, in black and white. Ms. Ruth M. Carter, standing in front of a bookshelf, a scarf wrapped neatly around her coiled hair, a soft smile, a familiar one. Jake's heart pounded. M. Carter, Miss Carter. He nearly dropped the book. The woman behind the library counter, the one he'd laughed at, mocked in front of his friends. She had written this. He turned the book over again, scanning the description. A memoir blending personal narrative and forgotten history. Shadows in the Wind chronicles a childhood shaped by segregation, grief, and resilience. Ruth M. Carter shares the untold stories of the women who raised her, the communities that sheltered her, and the libraries that saved her. Jake sank slowly onto a bench in the corner of the store, still holding the book. He had never once imagined Miss Carter had a life beyond the checkout desk. But here it was, her voice, printed and published, in a book sitting on a bestseller's table. Suddenly, every encounter with her reassembled in his mind like puzzle pieces snapping into place. The notebook, the people, the way she had looked at him that day, the patience in her eyes, the calm after his cruel joke. Jake felt heat rise to his face, shame, and something else, humility. The kind that cracks you open from the inside. He clutched the book to his chest and went straight to the counter. Jake didn't walk home from the bookstore, he ran. The book felt heavy in his backpack, but not in a way that bothered him. More like something sacred tucked close, something he shouldn't have left behind. His legs moved without thinking, weaving through streets he barely registered, his mind burning with questions and regrets. When he finally reached the library, breathless and red-faced, the sun had already begun to lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the sidewalk. The branches of the tall maple tree outside swayed gently, rustling with the wind like a whisper. The library looked just the same as always, quiet, still, humble. But now, it felt like a secret world he'd been blind to all along. He pushed open the door, the old bell above it chiming softly. Inside, everything was just as he'd left it days ago. The scent of paper and wood polish, the glow of amber light from the high windows, and the familiar tick of the wall clock. And behind the counter, of course, stood Miss Carter. Her grey scarf was different today, soft blue with tiny, embroidered flowers. Her cardigan was a dusty lavender, buttoned neatly, sleeves pushed up to her elbows. She was reading a returned book, flipping through the pages slowly as if savoring each one before returning it to the shelf. Jake hesitated in the doorway, suddenly, unsure of himself. How do you speak to someone after you've laughed at their legacy? But as if sensing him before he spoke, Miss Carter looked up. Her eyes met his and then she smiled. Not surprised, not smug, just knowing. So, she said softly, closing the book. You found it? Jake nodded, his throat dry. I didn't know it was you. Her smile deepened. Most don't. He stepped forward slowly, pulling the copy of Shadows in the Wind from his backpack. He placed it on the counter with a kind of reverence, like he was returning something borrowed from a sacred place. I read the back, he said quietly, and the prologue. I saw your picture. It's you, but younger. Double quotes. Miss Carter chuckled. Gently. Time does that to people. Softens the edges, adds lines to the corners. She tapped the book lightly. But the words, those stay young. Jake looked down at the cover, still stunned by what he now knew. You lived through all that? She didn't answer right away. Instead, she walked from behind the counter, her steps slow but sure, and motioned for him to follow her. They walked in silence to a corner of the library had never really paid attention to. A small alcove lined with local history books and framed black and white photographs. There was one of a protest, young people holding signs, some smiling, some solemn. Jake leaned closer. In the middle of the crowd, nearly hidden in the back, was a teenage girl with braids and fierce eyes. That was me, Miss Carter said softly behind him. 16. That march was in 68. They shut our school down that week. My brother and I went anyway. Jake turned to look at her, speechless. I was raised in Mississippi, she continued. Back when signs still told you where you couldn't sit or drink or eat. I lost friends to violence. Lost my father to a job one else wanted, but black men always got. And I nearly lost myself to anger. Jake swallowed hard, his heart beat heavy in his chest. I didn't want to become bitter, she said, her voice like warm earth. So I wrote stories about us, about our pain, but also our hope. I wanted children who looked like me to read something and see themselves not just as victims, but as survivors, dreamers, builders. She paused, her eyes misting slightly. When no one wanted to publish me, I kept writing. I built literacy programs in shelters. I taught women how to read their first books in their 40s. I worked nights and wrote on lunch breaks. It took 30 years before anyone noticed, and by then, I didn't need them to. Jake stood still, frozen not from fear, but from awe. I thought you were just a librarian, he whispered. Miss Carter turned to him, her eyes warm but firm. There is no just about it, Jake. Every book you've ever opened, someone gave their life to create. Someone like me made sure it ended up in your hands. Jake looked down at the floor, guilt rising in his chest like smoke. I made fun of you, he said, barely audible, in front of my friends. I didn't know. I was so stupid. Double quotes. Miss Carter didn't scold him. She simply placed a hand on his shoulder, gentle, steady. You allowed before you listened, she said. Now, you're listening. That's the beginning of wisdom. Jake looked up, tears stinging the edges of his eyes, though he wouldn't let them fall. Can I read the rest? She nodded. Take your time. There's more truth in those pages than in most places you'll go. Jake took the book back into his hands, this time holding it differently, as if it mattered, because now he knew it did. And for the first time, he realized stories weren't just words. They were people. And Miss Carter's story had just become his turning point. Jake didn't leave the library that day, the same boy who entered. He sat in one of the corner reading chairs for nearly an hour after their conversation, the weight of shadows in the wind in his hands, and the even heavier truth settling into his chest. The words he had once flung like stones, mocking, careless, sharp, echoed in his memory now with shame. But more than that, he felt something unfamiliar blooming in him. Respect. Not the kind taught in assemblies or school handbooks, the kind that grows from witnessing quiet strength. When the library was nearly empty, and the sun cast long, honey-colored stripes across the floor, Jake stood up and walked slowly back to the front desk. Miss Carter was there, sorting a stack of returned books, like she always did, but her presence felt different to him now, less like background noise, and more like a pillar holding something important in place. He swallowed hard. Miss Carter, he said softly. She looked up, that same gentle warmth in her expression. No bitterness, no coldness. Just patience. Jake fidgeted with the edge of the book jacket. I just wanted to say I'm sorry for the way I talked to you, for how I treated you. He paused, his voice shaking slightly. I didn't know who you were. I didn't know what you'd done, and I never even tried to find out. Miss Carter's eyes didn't narrow, her shoulders didn't stiffen. Instead, she let out a soft sigh and offered a kind, weathered smile. Oh, Jake, she said. You were never supposed to know all at once. That's not how stories work. They're meant to unfold one page at a time. He looked up, surprised. You're not mad? She shook her head. Why would I be angry at a young man who finally opened his eyes? We all laugh before we understand. I did too, once. Jake's lips parted, but no words came. All he could do was nod. Then Miss Carter turned and unlocked the bottom drawer of her desk, the one she rarely touched when others were watching. From it, she pulled out a thick bundle of papers, bound with a ribbon the color of deep wine. The pages were slightly yellowed at the edges, and between them peaked blue ink scribbled in the margins, lines crossed out, words added in flowing cursive. She placed it gently on the counter in front of him. The first version, she said, before editors and publishers, before anyone thought it was worth printing. Jake looked down at it like it was a treasure. Your original manuscript. She nodded. If you're ready to read, really read, then start here. His fingers brushed the edge of the first page, reverent. That night, he didn't turn on his Xbox. He didn't scroll through memes, or respond to the group chat pinging nonstop on his phone. Instead, he curled up in bed with a reading lamp and Miss Carter's manuscript. He read every word. Every chapter felt like stepping into another world, but one that had lived right next to his all along. He read about her childhood, the fear and fire of protests, the quiet rebellion of teaching women to read when the system said they weren't worth educating. He read about grief and dignity, about moments when silence was both armor and art. He cried once, not out of pity, but from the weight of truth raw, and UNPOLISHED. By summarize, he'd finished the last page. Jake didn't just understand Miss Carter's story now. He felt it in his bones. A week later, Jake showed up to the library on a Saturday, Morning-voluntarily. Ms. Carter was restocking shelves in the children's section when she saw him walk in. "No school today, is there?" she asked with a raised brow. He grinned sheepishly and held up a canvas tote bag. "Nope, but I figured. If you need help, I've got to hands and no excuses." From that day forward, Jake came back again and again. He started shelving returns, helping younger kids find books, even learning how to organize the catalog system. He showed up early, stayed late, and asked questions, real questions. Not about due dates or where the comic books were, but about her work, her writing, her memories, and every once in a while, Miss Carter would hand him a story yet published, or a journal entry from decades ago. She began to trust him, just as a student of books, but a student of truth. To others, he was just another volunteer, a helpful kid with a growing interest in literature. But Miss Carter saw something else. She saw the boy who once laughed, now listening. The boy who once judged, now serving. Jake no longer saw the library as dusty or dull. He saw it for what it was, a vault of living stories, held together by a woman who had become something of a quiet legend in his life. He still had growing up to do, still had lessons to learn, but now he faced the world with eyes open, and in his heart a promise had taken root, to never laugh before listening, to never assume he knew someone's story just by the cover, and to carry Miss Carter's legacy word by word, act by act into whatever he would one day become. The classroom was unusually quiet that morning. The hum of the fluorescent lights buzzed softly overhead, and outside the windows, a late spring breeze nudged the blinds with slow, lazy taps. Inside, rows of students sat with their papers folded in front of them, each waiting their turn. It was presentation day. Mr. Landry stood near the whiteboard, clipboard in hand, calling students up one by one to deliver their final book reports. Most of the class was half bored, heads resting on palms, eyes already glazed over from hearing too many summaries that began with "I picked this book because." Jake sat near the back, hands folded tightly around his printed report, the corners of the pages soft from being gripped too often. He wasn't nervous in the usual way, not like when he gave math presentations or forgot his science notes. This was different. His name was called. He stood slowly, took a deep breath, and walked to the front of the room. For a moment, he just stood there, looking at the cover page of his report. Then he looked up. "This is the book I chose," he said, lifting the worn paperback gently from his bag. "Shadows in the Wind" by R.M. Carter. The same copy he'd bought at the bookstore months ago. Its cover slightly bent now, the pages marked by folded corners and quiet revelations. "I didn't pick this book because it was easy," he began, "or because it was short. I picked it because it changed me." The room stilled. Jake looked at the book in his hands again. His voice, steady but soft, carried across the classroom a confession. "This book is about a woman who grew up in a world that told her she didn't matter, who lost people she loved, who had doors slammed in her face, and who lived through pain most of us couldn't imagine." He paused. A lump was building in his throat, but she didn't become angry. She didn't give up. She wrote. She taught. She helped people who had nothing and never asked for praise. Jake swallowed hard, his eyes flickering to the back of the classroom, as if Miss Carter might be there, unseen. "I used to laugh at her," he admitted, his voice cracking. "I thought she was just some old librarian who lived in a dusty building. I didn't know who she was. I didn't bother to ask. I judged her because she was quiet, because I thought being loud meant being important." The classroom was silent. Now, even Mr. Landry had stopped writing. Jake took a breath, grounding himself. "But then I read her story, her real story, and I realized," his voice caught again, "sometimes the greatest heroes are the quietest people, and sometimes we need to read before we judge." He looked around the room, not with arrogance, but with honesty, with the kind of vulnerability that takes courage to offer. "I've been volunteering at the library ever since," he said. Because I don't want to just say I learned something. I want to live it. He placed the book on the teacher's desk, gently, like placing a flower on a grave. Then he sat down. No one clapped, not out of indifference but because no one wanted to break the moment. The truth of it hung in the air like a bell that had just rung and hadn't finished echoing yet. Later that evening, in the stillness of the library, Miss Carter sat at her desk once more. The windows were open, letting in the sweet scent of lilacs from the garden she had planted years ago along the back wall. She was reading, as always, but this time she held something new in her hands, a printed copy of Jake's report. She smiled softly as she read the final paragraph. We don't always recognize greatness when it's quiet, but it's therein. The people who make space for others to be seen, in the stories that weren't supposed to survive, and in the hearts of those who choose to listen before speaking. Miss Carter taught me that, not by lecturing me, not by yelling, but by living it. She closed the report, folded it neatly, and slid it into the same drawer where her manuscript once lived, outside. The sun dipped low behind the rooftops of Willow Ridge. The trees whispered in the breeze, and the old library stood like a monument to time, filled with thousands of lives pressed between pages. And on the screen, if this were a film, it would fade to black with one final quote, written in quiet white letters across the dark. Even in silence, there is a story waiting to be heard. R.M. Carter.